Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of English 124, Writing About Literature. So we're continuing our unit on short fiction, and I have another lecture for you about literary elements and devices used in short fiction, so make sure that you watch that. This week, we're going to be reading Charles, Strawberry Spring, and Everyone's Favorite Blonde. I really chose these 3 stories because the thing that they have in common is interesting narration. One of the literary elements that you're going to be looking at and talking about is point of view. And Charles is a short story about a mother and her young son and his friend from school, Charles. Now, we never see Charles on the page. He's always off page. So the narration is done by the mother, who's never named, and she's reacting to Charles much differently than her son. I think this story, even though it was written in, I think, the 1930s, it's pretty relatable to anybody who's dealt with kids, that children are seeing things from a totally different perspective. The mother, interestingly enough, is kind of an unreliable narrator because her knowledge of Charles is really limited. She's never actually seen him. She's never actually interacted with him. So we have these stories of this kid who has pretty bad behavior from her son, who thinks it's hilarious. And then we see her reaction where she's like, oh, I don't know, this Charles sounds like a bad apple, that kind of thing. So, we come to know the mom and her son, and later on we hear from the teacher about Charles, but everything's from the mother's perspective. It's interesting because a lot of times children are used as unreliable narrators because they're the ones who don't really have all of the information. So here we're kind of flipping that power dynamic a little bit and giving the power to the son rather than to his mother. So it's kind of fun and interesting. We can continue our thoughts about characterization and conflict. Who is the mom? Who is the little boy? Who is Charles? What do we know about these characters? How does the author build their personalities? In Strawberry Spring by Stephen King, we have another unreliable narrator. And one of the other things that I want you to pay attention to in this story in particular is the setting. We have some period details about the 1960s. The story was written, I think, in the 1980s or 90s. So the period details of the early 60s are kind of important to the story. College campus. What is life on that campus like before these very dark things begin to happen? And also, the author is using the weather to convey mood. That's something called pathetic fallacy. And in particular, you need to pay attention to the fog. What does the fog symbolize? When does it roll in? How does it affect people? And how does it affect the narrator? Strawberry Spring is a time when you have kind of like a January thaw. They kind of compare it to that. So it's a time that only comes around every few years. So again, the weather is kind of playing a role in this story. And then ask yourselves about the narrator. What does the narrator know? What does he really not know? And what might he be holding back, and why is he holding those details back? With Everyone's Favorite Blonde, this is a really interesting story because we don't have too many things in short fiction where we have multiple narrators. And this is told from multiple first-person point of view. So we have a woman who is accused of murder, and we hear from the first narrator is kind of like the guy collecting these stories and visiting this neighborhood where this woman is talked about. He's not named. Then we meet the neighbor, a journalist, a social worker, and we see how the author is using all of these different people to build a picture of who this woman is. So it's interesting narration. It's also very interesting plot structure because it's not a traditional story where we have A happens, then B happens, then C happens. The action is kind of done in flashbacks and in almost like a ghost story talking about this woman. So I'd like you to notice there the different structure, notice the different points of view, and ask how they're building this characterization, this portrait of the woman who was accused of these things. Then you'll have a discussion forum about those stories. So make sure that you post once and then comment at least 2 times on other people's posts. You're going to be answering questions about each one of the stories. And as we go along, you are going to need those other literary elements to make sure you don't skip the lecture, because the lecture this week and the lecture last week are really going to be important going forward for the whole class. So that's it. I can't wait to see what you think of these stories and how you interpret them. Thanks, everybody.